The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Journalism professor Brooke Kroeger reveals the role of prominent men in New York society who helped women get the vote almost a century ago. Law professor Geoffrey Stone has written a history of sex and the Constitution, showing how abortion, obscenity, and contraception were no big deal before the evangelical movement of the 1800s. And Stephanie Schriock of Emily's List talks with Bill Press about the surge in women running for office. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Brooke Kroeger, a journalist and author, has written an interesting account of how prominent men worked a century ago to get passage of the women's suffrage amendment. And we say hello to Brooke Kroeger, former reporter, now a journalism professor at New York University. She is also the author of 5 books, the latest of which is The Suffragants: How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. Brooke Kroeger, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you for asking me.
Well, it's nice to have you with us. And so you have written the history of a little-known aspect of the women's movement, the organized effort of men to push for women's suffrage 100 years ago. Why did these business and professional men do it?
Well, first of all, this group, which involved Republicans, Democrats, socialists, independents, it really was a wide range, but the commonality came in the fact that they were progressives. They were people who believed in supporting a just cause. And of course, this era in the 1910s, when this was going on from about 1909 to 1919, there was, a great push. We had waves of immigrants coming in. African American rights were extremely important, education, building on the gains that had already been made. And as women came to the fore, and in this period started to enlist, recruit, cajole, invite the support of prominent, powerful individuals, both men and women, people who were major figures initially in New York society. This started to happen. In many cases, in most cases, the men were invited into the suffrage struggle campaign by their wives, their lovers, their sisters, their mothers. There was generally some woman in their lives who either represented the importance of women's rights for them or was really active in the campaign in this period. For a long time, the suffrage movement was really not excited about the idea of having organized male support, though there had been an effort in New York as early as 1874, I learned. And these men were lawyers and other things, but I think they tended to be too ideological. And as Anna Howard Shaw said to Oswald Garrison Villard when he proposed the idea, we have enough trouble with the isms among the women activists. We don't need them from the men. This group were lawyers, doctors, clergymen, professors, industrialists, financiers, Wall Street guys. So they represented the kind of men who could do the most for the movement, and that's why the women finally decided it was a good idea. But of course, the idea came from the men. It came from Villard.
Interesting. Why was it important to call attention to these suffragants?
Why was it important for me? Obviously, It hasn't been important for a century, so it was important to me for several reasons. First of all, with the anniversaries of the 100th anniversaries of suffrage coming up in New York this year on November 6th, and then, of course, the federal centennial anniversary, which will be in 2019 and 2020, 2019 for the passage of the constitutional change, and then 2020 for the ratification. I wanted to do something that I felt was fresh. That's a through line for my books. I always want to do something that no one else has done. I'd like to be, the first into the fray. I suppose that's a product of my wire service background. I like to be first. But so I was thinking about what would be something that hasn't been done, something that would be fresh, thinking about these anniversaries coming up. At the time, it was 5 years hence. And then I started to ask myself, how could the women have succeeded without the help of men? They must have had it because the legislatures were full of men. The voters were mostly all men except for in a few Western states. They had to have had support. So, of course, with the wonders of Google, it's not so hard to come up with the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, which, of course, to me was a great surprise, and I imagine to many others. As I started to investigate it, it at first seemed that it was like a lot of the male support we've seen today, with all due respect. Nominal, celebrity endorsement, lend a name, lend a hand, not something that was really organized with a constitution and a charter and, participation that was so deep that I find their own signatures on the invoices for $1 membership. I mean, it wasn't like it was a showpiece that the women were really doing the heavy lifting for. They actually did the work of, maintaining and supporting an organization, which, as you know, is not a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there was actually, and I found this very surprising, a call from prominent men for women's suffrage all the way back to colonial times?
This is true. It was not like people organized and formed an organization to help, but, right. As early as Thomas Paine in 1775, he wrote an occasional letter to the female sex. Benjamin Rush offered thoughts on female education as early as 1787. And there were, other such efforts in that very early period, but really nothing like this. And, in checking with Michael Kimmel, who's the great expert on men and feminism, and who actually wrote the original book called Against the Tide, Pro-Feminist Men in the United States from 1776 to 1990, that's how long ago that book was. I put it to him, I just said, has this happened before or since? Is there anything like this that we know of in American history? And he, at the time, confirmed to me, this was just when I was starting my research, that indeed there does not really seem to have been or to be anything quite like it.
We're speaking with Brooke Kroeger, journalism professor at New York University, author of many books, the latest of which is The Suffragents, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. And this is my next question. Kind of refers back to something you mentioned. In modern fights now for equal pay, reproductive rights, and laws against trafficking and sexual assault, are men playing any real leadership roles, or is it considered politically inappropriate for them to do so?
No, goodness, no, it shouldn't be politically inappropriate. Hope not.
It shouldn't be inappropriate at all. But is that the reality?
And I don't think it's a question of inappropriate. I think it's a question of not being a priority or an interest. Though we have seen some flickerings. For example, very recently, like in the last couple of weeks, Ashton Kutcher held a live Facebook meeting that thousands of people listened in on to talk about the issues for women in tech, in terms of equal pay and equal opportunity and such as that. And then, are you familiar with He for She, the UN Women's Organization effort, which has been going on for about 3 years now? Justin Trudeau has sort of a nominal role within this. Emma Watson has been their main spokesman. Though I love Emma Watson, I was always a little querulous as to why they would choose a woman to be, the celebrity endorser for He for She, though she does a lot more than that. The organization is based in UN Women. And what they've done, are you familiar with it?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, what they've done is go into several arenas on the question of equality, which is, equity, which is a good one because it's fairly clean. It's not fraught with religious issues or other things that can get in the way. I mean, equal pay seems pretty straightforward to me, but, maybe it isn't always. nonetheless, so they have enlisted academic officers, head academic officers, CEOs, and government leaders from around the world who will, I hope I'm not oversimplifying this, but who will agree to a set of goals that their organization will undertake. And, the only question I would have is that all the heavy lifting is being done by UN Women. The leadership of the organization is all female, though obviously they're enlisting the help of men who agree to be he's for she. There's another great organization called Athena Swan that's mostly in the UK and the former British Commonwealth. And this started as an organization to push the agenda of women in STEM fields. And now they've expanded to include not only women, but other disadvantaged groups. And they've gone beyond STEM to, other academic arenas to make sure that women's equity is starting to happen. Those are two examples I can think of, but in neither case, also Athena Swan was started by two women, though the organization now is led by a leadership that's both male and female. And indeed, some of the men initially started in suffrage organizations that had both men and women or were led by women and men joined, like the one that the Equal Franchise Society, which a society dame, Catherine Dewar Mackey, had started and attracted, a great array of A-list names in the New York financial and social world.
Now, when states wrote their constitutions, were women excluded from the right to vote on purpose or simply because that's just the way it always was?
Well, all I can tell you is the word male is there, and the move in every state to change the Constitution was to remove the word male. So you can draw your own conclusion about that.
Right.
You have to remember women had very defined roles in society at this time and expectations. And, some of this dates back to the Greeks. They excluded the women too. It just was the way things had been done for, thousands of years. The movement organized as a women's movement took 70 years to reach this goal. And I'm sure there's those who would argue with this, but those last 10 years from 1909 to 1919 were simply pivotal. And I would submit, though I could be wrong, that a decent part of the reason was the engagement of people who were in a position to access power, who often happen to be male.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also point out that a lot of male leaders and even some females themselves simply felt that women were not smart enough to vote. But was that the real reason for organized opposition to women's suffrage?
There were, like in every similar case, many reasons for the opposition. Some were based on women's role and women's feeling about it. Some were based on very strong feelings about women and their children and the time it took to run a household and the importance of being that anchor within the house, a role that nobody presumed men could take on, which in itself is pretty interesting. From a political standpoint, there were also reasons. You could not get the support of senators in the South. Why do you think? You want to answer?
I was going to let you, but...
Okay, I will. It would have almost doubled the black vote in the South. So that was one of the big reasons why the Southerners would not come on board.
Wow, that answer was hanging right in front of me, too.
Yeah, and no one would mention that. One of the great things about what makes you love W.E.B. Du Bois was he was a great fellow traveler. He wasn't, in the league per se, but he devoted 2 full issues of The Crisis, the NAACP magazine, to women's suffrage, doing big symposia with both white and black leaders in one case and all black leaders in another, female and male. And his 2 arguments were unassailable, as a spokesman or someone appealing to the black community that wasn't really on board for this. They saw this a lot as a white middle-class women's initiative. But he said, first of all, as African Americans, I'm paraphrasing, of course, we have to support anyone's fight against disenfranchisement because that looms for all. So you must be on the side of it. You just simply must. And secondly, it would double the black vote. I mean, these were both very, very good reasons that were hard to argue with within the African American community.
Absolutely.
So, that's what engaged his support.
Wow. Okay. Brooke Kroeger, former reporter, now journalism professor at New York University, author of 5 books, the latest, The Suffragants, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
You're so welcome, and again, thank you so much for asking me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Constitutional law professor Geoffrey Stone has written a history of how religion took over the courts and legislatures to prohibit what was for ages considered legal and normal sexual activity. More on that in just a moment. Right now we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Newsflash. Republican congressional leaders have come up with yet another grand scheme to fix America's healthcare system. So look out, because when they say fix, they mean it in the same sense your veterinarian uses the word. For the gazillionth time, GOP lawmakers have put a shiny new ribbon on their same old ugly package of health insurance deforms. As before, this latest plan would eliminate coverage for millions of Americans, raise the price of insurance for the middle class, and deliver much less care. But one guy says he loves it. A great bill, tweeted Donald Trump. I'm guessing that, once again, our Twitterer-in-chief hasn't actually read the bill he's praising, or even scanned the factual summary of what it does. But he might want to hear the opinions of his fellow corporate chieftains, who have read every word of it. For example, the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield flatly rejects the rewrite because it, quote, would allow states to waive key consumer protections and undermine safeguards for those with pre-existing conditions. Also, he points out that the plan would increase uncertainty in the marketplace, making coverage more expensive and jeopardizing Americans' choice of health plans. Or Trump could ponder the conclusion of a health policy expert. The bill is, quote, just basically injecting chaos in 50 state capitals for the next 2 years. Or maybe he would value a state health executive's perspective. Quote, the bill's cuts would be devastating to Alaska's healthcare system, and patients will bear the consequences through reduced access to health care and lost insurance coverage. This is Jim Hightower saying Trump and the GOP are wasting Congress's time and what little public credibility they have left by continuing to play partisan politics with people's health. There's nothing great about that.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor. All for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. It's getting harder and harder to be a good Christian, says law professor Geoffrey Stone, author of a book about sex and the Constitution. He reveals that the state with the most internet porn is Utah. And we say hello to Geoffrey R. Stone, who's the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago and one of the nation's leading constitutional lawyers. He has written a provocative new book called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. Geoffrey Stone, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Delighted to be here, Jim.
The Declaration of Independence, of course, America's founding document, states that among the basic human rights is the pursuit of happiness. Yet we have a long history of denying or punishing the one thing that, quite frankly, makes most people happy, sex. How do you explain that?
Well, at the time the framers wrote the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution, it was at the height of the Enlightenment, and they had a very strong sense of individual freedom and liberty. And they lived in a world that largely reflected that. With respect to issues like sex, for example, there were no laws at that time against obscenity. There were no laws against contraception. There were no laws against abortion. And there was a lot of sexually open expression available. And I think they assumed that was going to be the world of the future. But it didn't turn out that way. In the early years of the 19th century, the Second Great Awakening occurred, which was kind of an evangelical explosion that led to the enactment for the first time of obscenity laws in the United States. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, under the leadership of Anthony Comstock, those obscenity laws were enacted in every state in the nation and federal legislation as well. And then a movement also arose at that time for the first time to make both contraception and abortion unlawful. So it was largely the influence of religion in a very moralistic way that influenced the legislative process and that basically changed the world quite dramatically from what it had been at the time the Constitution was adopted.
So it's the Puritan Pilgrims perhaps to blame for America's prudishness about sex?
Well, not the Puritans as such. I mean, the Puritans did live in a world that was very much like that, but the Puritan ideal had disappeared by the end of the 17th century, and their influence, I think, was fairly modest. But it was a re-instigation of those kinds of values that clearly did shape the way in which our laws with respect to those matters evolved. And so by the time you get to the early 20th century, obscenity, which was defined as anything, any image, any word, any description that would cause even the most vulnerable member of society, which meant children, to have sexual thoughts, was completely prohibited. And as I said, laws against contraception and abortion had become universal. And the era of prudery that really continued largely intact until the 1950s had been put into place. But it's important for people to understand that that was not the world in which our nation was founded.
So where did this come from? What happened that changed from our founding fathers to as we moved into the to the 1800s to the 1900s?
Well, it was again a reemergence of aggressive Christian doctrine that had largely been muted by the time of the Revolution and by the time that the Constitution was enacted. At that time, for example, the founders of our Constitution, people like Jefferson and Adams and Washington and Madison, thought of themselves more as deists than as traditional Christians. They believed that there was a creator, but it was a creator that was nothing like the personal God that Christianity had developed. And they believed that the core moral function was, as Adams once put it, to be kind and just. And to do unto others. And beyond that, they thought religion should not dictate human behavior. It was the resurgence of religion in the same way we've seen it in the latter part of the 20th century with the moral majority. for an extended period of time, organized religion as a political force in the United States had largely fallen into the background through the 20th century. But in 1979, with Jerry Falwell's creation of the moral majority, and ever since then, we've seen a powerful resurgence of evangelical Christianity in particular, as a political force in the nation. And that's what happened in the 19th century.
We're speaking with Geoffrey Stone, Levy Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, one of the nation's leading constitutional lawyers, and his latest book called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. If sexual behavior was supposed to be a moral or religious matter, how did things like homosexuality, contraception, adultery, how did they become matters of law in a country founded on separation of church and state?
The arguments that were made did not say explicitly, because we hold this religious belief, this conduct should be prohibited. If a legislature enacted a law against obscenity or contraception or abortion or homosexuality explicitly in those terms, courts would have held that unconstitutional as a violation of the separation of church and state. But instead, people understood that because they couldn't do that explicitly, they would make arguments that tried to separate the reasons for these laws from the pure religious beliefs that generally motivated them. So, for example, with obscenity, the argument was that the availability of obscenity created a society in which people were much freer about their sexual activity because they'd been motivated by what they read and what they saw, and that would lead to premarital sex, that would lead to extramarital sex, would lead to adultery, and that those were things that were destructive of the family, and that the reason for banning obscenity was not simply because it violated someone's religious belief, but the argument was cast in terms of it had negative consequences. And similarly, with contraception, the argument that women, if they knew they could have sex without the fear of pregnancy, would become much more tempted to act upon those desires, and therefore denying them access to contraception was a way of keeping them chaste. And the reason for that, the argument went, was not because chastity was part of our religious belief, but because a lack of chastity would produce children born out of wedlock, which was bad for the children. It would lead to women committing adultery, which was bad for marriages. And so the arguments were cast not in terms of we are imposing our religious beliefs on you, but on the argument that there are secular reasons for these laws, even though everyone knew what was driving the impetus was the religious belief.
Now, obviously with obscenity, you can make the argument for free speech. But what about some of these others, contraception and things like that? I mean, where does that cross the line constitutionally to have laws in place against these things? So
there's a couple of reasons why this makes sense. One of them is that it's important to understand that when the framers adopted the Constitution, they were very concerned that by giving a list of explicit constitutional rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, right to due process of law, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, and so on, that would create the implication that those were the only rights retained by the people. And these were men of the Enlightenment when they drafted the Constitution. They believed resolutely that knowledge expands over time, that with experience we gain understanding, and that they were not in a position to list all of the rights that might be thought to be fundamental in our society. And so they added, drafted by Madison, the Ninth Amendment, which provided that the enumeration of specific rights in the Constitution shall not be taken to deny or disparage other rights retained by the people. So the framers themselves expressly invited the understanding that there are constitutional rights other than those that are listed explicitly in the Constitution. And the challenge that poses to courts, of course, is to figure out how do they identify those rights over time. And so with the issue of contraception, when the court first confronted that question as a constitutional matter in 1965 in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, By 1965, most states had abandoned their 19th century laws against contraception, but Connecticut had not. And that Connecticut law was challenged by a married couple who claimed that the law denying them the ability to get information about contraception and to purchase contraceptives violated their fundamental rights to decide for themselves how to live their most intimate marriage relationship and whether they wished to bear or beget a child. And the Supreme Court held that that law was unconstitutional, that it infringed upon the fundamental right of a married couple, in that instance, to make those decisions independently and for themselves without the intrusion of government in the intimate relations of a marriage. And then several years later, the court addressed the question that inevitably came next, which was, what about unmarried people? Right? Do unmarried people also have a constitutional right to access to contraception? And the Supreme Court said yes. The Supreme Court said basically that for the state to say that if unmarried people choose to have sex, that the penalty for that is to have an unwanted child in a pregnancy, that is irrational. That's not an appropriate or sensible penalty. And that, again, the right of the individual to decide for himself or herself whether to bear or beget a child is fundamental. And indeed, it's important to understand in these cases that the court could invoke the fact that at the time the Constitution was adopted, there were no laws against contraception. And even though the framers didn't put a constitutional right to contraception in the Constitution itself, the world in which they lived never suggested there was a need for such a right, because it was taken for granted that people would have that right. So the court basically said that this freedom to decide for oneself whether to bear or beget a child is fundamental to the individual and is implicitly guaranteed in the Constitution.
And Geoffrey, what do you make of the fact that evangelical Christians who want morality written into law are among some of the most adulterous and divorced people in America? Well,
that may be the product of the fact, assuming that's true, and I don't know that to be a fact, but you're asserting it as a fact. Assuming that's true, I suppose it may be that trying to maintain the purity that their religion demands it makes it very difficult to stay married. And one of the other things they do know statistically is that the state that has the highest level of individuals using pornography on the internet is Utah, which reflects the same type of phenomenon. And so it may be that the fact that in a society in which individuals have greater access to sexual freedom, they're actually more likely to be happy in marriage than if they're living in a world in which they're trying to adhere to what may in fact be a completely unnatural set of constraints, which then leads them to do things that are very destructive to the marriage relation.
Okay. Geoffrey Stone, Edward H. Levy, Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. His new book is called Sex and the Constitution, Sex, Religion, and Law from America's Origins to the 21st Century. Geoffrey, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org and look forward to having you back again soon.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Stephanie Schriock of Emily's List.
Stephanie Schriock, the president of Emily's List, here in studio with us. It's great to see you. Thank you so much for coming in.
I'm thrilled to be here. And since you're talking about Randy Weingarten and AFT, I just want to say
one of the best?
Big thank you to her and the work she's doing. We just did a training. I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but a training of women in New Mexico in partnership with the American Federation of Teachers.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Teachers who are stepping up, wanting to run for office, want to make sure that they're protecting students and communities and public schools. And they were so impressive. They're just really talented future candidates.
Yeah. I mean, Randy's on the front lines but everywhere on every important issue.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
She's a good partner to all of us.
Absolutely. Before we get back into that, I do want to ask you, so we were just talking before the break about this effort to repeal Obamacare. I don't know whether people realize how bad this measure is, even compared to the last one?
I am concerned that people don't understand. This is by far the worst repeal bill that they've all come up with. It is devastating. It just completely dismantles the programs that would protect pre-existing conditions and just basic essential health services. I mean, it's why you've got, Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, so Emily's List doesn't support her, but I got to tell you, like, she has been a real leader here in saying things like it's got to be good for the people of Alaska. Well, they're not going to get the same sort of care and service and funding that they need under this bill. It's a bad idea, and Americans have got to, as they're doing all over the country, they got to stand up, be heard, and put pressure on these senators.
You know what I don't understand is when you look at the states that will be impacted, particularly like West Virginia, there are a lot of Trump voters in West Virginia, right? I mean, Trump voters and losing Medicaid. Yeah. Some of the people who are the Trump's base are going to be the most severely impacted by this bill.
It's devastating. It's exactly right. But that's not what this is about. It's about dismantling government. It's about making people sort of survive on their own. But on the other hand, and we know this, we've talked about this for years, you don't provide basic health care. We all end up paying more at the end of the day. It hurts our economy. It is more expensive. And we keep doing this cycle, and it doesn't make any sense. I think about Nevada. Here you've got the Republican governor, Brian Sandoval, out there saying, we got to not repeal this. We are finally providing health insurance for thousands and thousands of Nevadans. And you got Senator Dean Heller out there, who's like marching with the party, doesn't care about the people of Nevada, the people of this country. It's short-sighted. They think they need this for some political win, but I'll tell you, they're going to be punished. They're already going to be punished in 2018 for this.
And women particularly impacted.
It's devastating. It's devastating. I mean, just on the pre-existing conditions alone. I mean, keep in mind, a pre-existing condition in this country is pregnancy.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Which all of us have been involved with, by the way, in some format. This is but it's also it is domestic violence. It's if you've been abused,
care,
it's
right?
like basic preventive care. But it's also women who, like, not all, but for the most part, women are taking care of the health care bills and managing health care for their parents, for their spouse's parents, for their kids. And you throw a wrench into all of this, and this health insurance is gone for tens of millions of people. It's going to be devastating to women across the country.
I get the question all the time, is there anything that we can be, any positive news out of the fact that Donald Trump was elected president? And one of the positive things that I see, first of all, I see maybe better investigative journalism as a result of that than we've seen since Watergate.
It's been so impressive.
Particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post. But also more political energy from the grassroots, including women particularly who want to step up and run for office and respond. And it's all started for me with the Women's March, which was such the greatest political thing I've ever been involved in. So what are you seeing at Emily's List?
So impressive, and it's not just It's not just the marching. I mean, they were there. We were all marching, right? We were there to march, but the truth is, it started the day after the election last year at Emily's List, where women found our website. And we didn't even have this on the homepage, by the way. They clicked through this one little link that says, I'm interested in running. Tell me when there's a training. In 4 weeks, there are over 1,000 women already who had said, I'm interested in running. Doesn't mean they're running right now, but I'm interested in running. You got to understand, we've been around for 33 years. We have encouraged, persuaded, sometimes begged women to run for office. And today, I can proudly say that we're well over 18,000 women.
Oh my God!
Representing all 50 states who say, "I want to run," crossing that first big barrier that we've been trying to figure out how to cross numbers for decades.
So this is the Trump bump.
It is. I know. I don't want to give him credit for it.
But 18,000, and are they? They're not running for what office?
It's right. We ask, and the truth is, the majority of them are looking at state and local offices. They're looking at city council, school boards. They're not. This isn't folks who said, "I'm going to run for Congress tomorrow."
Right.
And
no, that's where we need
them, right?
Absolutely.
That's where we need
the farm
folks.
team.
It's extraordinary, and you think about, the great women who have come up that path, serving in their local office and working their way up. I mean, I always go to Maggie Hassan, who's the U.S. Senator now in New Hampshire, who started off getting trained by Emily's List and other great women's groups before she ever thought about running, and became a state senator in New Hampshire. That was her whole story. Then she lost her state Senate seat. And I remind women all the time, just because you lose is not the end.
Yeah.
In our mind, a loss in an election is just a step in the process.
Nevertheless, she persisted, right?
That's exactly right. And for Maggie Hassan, she did. We got her to run for governor. She becomes governor. Now she's a U.S. senator. I think about these 18,000 women, and I think, in there are our next Elizabeth Warrens and Kamala Harris's and Kirsten Gillibrand's. It's our next Hillary Clinton's. Our second, third, and fourth women president could be in here. I am so excited that there's this energy and desire to have their voices heard in their communities, and that's what this is about.
And the impact that they can have on school boards, on city council, running for mayor, running for state legislature with reapportionment coming up. It's so critical, so important.
Right.
And then, step up to Congress and Senate.
That's right. That's right.
God bless
and
you,
those opportunities. And we've got great women who are doing that. We've been building a pipeline for 3 decades. We've got women running for the U.S. House all across the country, great Senate races. But these legislative seats are critical. And to everybody who's listening, go to the emilyslist.org site, check out the legislative chambers that we've put on notice that we want to swing from Republican hands, and then take a look at maybe 2 or 3 of your favorite legislative candidates. You probably will never have met these people, may never meet them, and support them, because these are the races we need to win before 2020, before we have the census that's coming up and redistricting. We've got to pick up these legislative seats, let alone stop all the terrible policies that the Republicans are pushing through.
Right. And, everybody wants to speculate about 2020, which we might even end up doing before this half hour is up. But 2018 is got to be the focus.
That's right.
2018 is
oh, my goodness.
so many important races
it
in
is.
2018.
The list is long. If you think about if you go back to the states and you think about these legislative seats that we've got to make, we've got to make inroads in now, then we got to hold in 2020. But think about the governor's races. There are 35 governorships in this country where the governor has a direct say in redistricting. Think about that. Who could veto redistricting? Florida, you can veto. We need to elect these Democratic governors quickly, and if we don't, we're gonna pay the price for it.
In fact, aren't there only 2 maybe women governors?
They're painting me.
Yeah,
they're painting me. But yes, there's 2 Democratic women governors. They are great.
Yeah, right.
And I use both Governor Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island and Governor Kate Brown in Oregon as examples of what it is to have strong Democratic women leading states with progressive legislatures. They're moving through policies that are really making families' lives better. It's equal pay and child care options and education. They are doing the things that we as progressives want to see the federal government do. It's happening in the states where we have these great leaders. So now we just got to do it in Michigan and Florida and Nevada and keep the list going. And we've got the candidates to do that. Great women running.
Stephanie Schriock with us, president of Emily's List. And very quickly she mentioned, I'll mention it again, emilyslist.org to go and really find out how you can plug in and support the organization as a man or a woman. And particularly if you're a woman, think about you're making a contribution by getting out there and jumping into the political process. It's exciting. It's fun. It's hard work.
It is.
But it's important.
It sure is.
Yeah, right.
It sure is.
So is this under the banner of your, what is it, On Notice program that Emily's List has launched? Is that what that's all about?
That's about the targeting these legislatures. Yes, absolutely. Really, really critical. Now, these fabulous 18,000 women who have signed up, and Bill, I got to tell you, it's every day. Like, I didn't get my report this morning, but yesterday, I think we had 17 women sign up. I don't know what happened yesterday. That 17 women said, this is my day to sign up. Every single day, women are signed up. This is called our Run to Win program. And under Run to Win, what we are doing is building out a digital platform where women can reach out to each other and reach out to Emily's List and talk about how to run for office, what are the basics, help each other. We're doing 25 plus trainings across the country.
These training sessions.
We do, and that's a piece of this puzzle. But we want folks to file for office. Like that's what we want you to do. On the job training is really good when you're running for a candidate. You can ask most of the men who have run, who are not sitting through hours and hours and hours of training in most places. But we're here to do trainings around the country. But even for our gals who are up in Fairbanks, Alaska, I'm not going to get to Fairbanks, Alaska this year to do a training, but we wanted to provide at least a digital platform where those women can also get the basics and to be in touch with each other, to talk about what it's like. You know, a lot of them have the same stories. If you're a woman who's running with young kids, they almost all get asked by somebody, who's going to take care of the kids when you're elected?
Right.
Well, you know, the way it always works, just like when I go to work, who takes care of the kids? Like we do it together. Or Gretchen Whitmer, who's running for governor in Michigan, doing really, really well. She got a little bit of a primary, but putting it together. She was at one of our events on Monday, and she says, I get asked all the time, are you going to run as a woman?
Oh. Yeah.
I'm like, she is by no choice of her own doing.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, right. But so these two programs go hand in hand. We're getting just like I said, thousands of women who are interested. We're going to train and recruit, try to place as many as we can in these key legislative races under our Unnoticed program, and then we're going to win these legislatures back.
There's a meeting in Nashville this week of attorneys general of the United States. Yes. Again, an area, I think, of Kamala Harris, former attorney general of my state of California.
That's right.
And it came to focus this week, I guess, because Lisa Madigan, who's a great Democrat from Illinois, saying that she was not going to run for re-election as attorney general of Illinois, but also not going to run for governor or for, whatever, senator, what higher office there.
As I like to say, that's not today does not mean not never.
Right. I would hope not.
I hope
her.
not too.
Yeah,
she's
a star,
phenomenal attorney general.
But this is a very important post. I mean, this post of state attorneys general.
It really is. And look at what it has meant under the Trump administration. How many of our Democratic attorneys general have been stepping up, filing suit, protecting their citizens. You've had, my goodness, the list goes on and on, but you've had Maura Healey from Massachusetts, who, in fact, this week filed suit against the loan. I'm sorry, Equifax.
Equifax.
Yeah, on a whole different. Yeah, so
right.
It's not just the Trump administration, excuse me, but to protect consumers and millions of Americans from these practices. Lori Swanson, who a lot of folks maybe haven't heard of as much. She's a fabulous attorney general out of Minnesota, rolls up her sleeve, keeps her head down, works. But she's been partnering with the attorney general in Washington State and others, whether it's on DACA or in the Muslim ban. She was really on the front line of that and is really tremendous. I think all of these women, like Kamala Harris, who's in the United States Senate, or Catherine Cortez Masto, who's a former attorney general in the United States Senate. It's a great opportunity for all of them to keep doing the work, but also, a good stepping stone for future. They shouldn't think about that, but that's my job.
Yeah. And men or women, the resistance on many issues to the policies of the Trump administration now is coming from the state's attorney general. Yesterday, our friend Javier Becerra from California filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration on the wall. They've already filed one against the ending of the Dreamers program with DACA.
Yes.
And now another one yesterday on the wall.
And I was really proud of the move to protect the Dreamers and people sometimes forget this, but former governor of Arizona, former Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano is now running the university system, University of California system in California, and has been a great advocate for Dreamers and is part of all of that as well. And it's like good partnerships, finding ways to work together. That's
What's interesting about that, so Janet Napolitano, head of the great University of California system, on behalf of the university, has filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration on the DACA program. But she knows what she's talking about when it comes to border issues, right? She's former U.S. Attorney for Arizona, former governor of Arizona, former Secretary of Homeland Security.
Yep.
So
she understands it, and I mean, she was Homeland Security in the first term of President Obama when all of this came to be. Mm-hmm. Like, she really understands what this was about, how this has come together, and what it has meant for these kids and now young adults who are really providing such energy and excitement and economic development in this country.
Right.
So I'm glad they're doing it.
We thought we were going to celebrate the first female president of the United States. Will there ever be one?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Brooke Kroeger, Geoffrey Stone, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.